And tonight we have a guest who will be speaking about suicide prevention. We have an author. He is a suicide prevention advocate, Carl David, and he will be discussing his book called Baderfield. And we would like to welcome Carl to the show today. Hello, Carl. Thank you so much for coming on to the Crystal Show. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm great. I appreciate the opportunity to come on tonight and sound off a little bit.
Yeah. The thing about, suicide, I think a lot of people are not really aware of the reasoning why people do what they do when it comes to suicide, what leads up to it, and how it affects so many people. I think that a lot of people they feel that the person is horribly selfish, or they don't understand the whys, and there's a lot of guilt involved. So give us so that's why we have you on tonight, to give a little bit more of information to people to learn more about what suicide is and how it affects people. So please tell us about your book.
I wrote this book originally as homage to my dad, who only lived 8 years after my brother took his life. My brother was 22, I was only 16, and we had no signs, no clues, no indication of anything at all, so we were totally blindsided. And, we went to a place after his death that was the darkest place we've ever been. This was uncharted territory for us, and never would we, in our wildest dreams, have dealt, anything like this, or thought it was coming. But suicide is an act that takes more than 1 million lives a year worldwide. 1 a day in the military, 22 to 23 a day among veterans. And, when I went through this in the 1960s, it was 1965, suicide was an act that was repugnant. It was you looked at this thing as a dirty act, and nobody wanted to acknowledge it. It was just one of these things that was looked at with a jaundiced eye. So it stayed buried. I mean, there were no outlets for people who thought they were on that edge to really go and get help, because in those days, if you went to go get help, you were sick. You were looked at as if this was something really bad, as opposed to healing and getting well. So it's just gotten to be an epidemic, and people take their lives for so many different reasons. They feel hopeless, they feel unloved, they feel alone, they're depressed. There may be a chemical depression that's caused by drugs. There may be just a chemical imbalance that someone has to live with and isn't aware of. So it's just an act that is really, really sad. And in a lot of cases, it's preventable, if someone can reach out to get help. But oftentimes they can't see past their own darkness and depression to realize that tomorrow's another day. There's help out there for them. They just can't see it.
And, when you talk about depression is something that a lot of people live with, and it has become, or it actually is, it's a disease, and a disease where the end result a lot of times is suicide, and suicide come in many forms. Suicide can be just behaviors that will lead to your death, reckless behaviors, drug use, etc. But one thing about, depression, a lot of people don't want to talk about it, even today. They don't want to let anybody know that, they're feeling so down that they feel that they need to get help. Now, more people today are seeking therapy, and they are seeking some sort of going to groups, and maybe, things like AA is a great help for people. But that's even different than saying, I feel down, I'm depressed, I need help. Because then that goes into a mental thing, and it's still a stigma for a lot of people.
Right, exactly. I mean, today, thank God, therapy is something that is something that's looked upon as a good thing, that so many people are in therapy and they're getting help. I think it's fabulous. I could not have survived if I had not had the advantage of having a psychoanalysis. I was literally coming unraveled. When I was out of college, I was leaving my body randomly and uncontrollably, And my parents had, the foresight and heads-up vision to see that something was really wrong, and they were, they graciously got me the help that I needed. And I remember when I went to see a psychiatrist, when he couldn't treat me because he was too much of a family friend, but he referred me to someone who was extraordinary. And when I had a couple sessions with this doctor, he said to me at one point, you're a perfect candidate for analysis. And I said, oh my God, I must really be sick, because all I thought of was Woody Allen being in analysis for 15 years, not getting any better. So he explained to me, no. He said, you have to be really intelligent, you have to be perceptive, and you have to be willing to work hard to get to the bottom of the problems, so that the ghosts of the future become the ancestors of the past. And I did it. It took me 4 years, but it literally saved my life.
Now, what would you recommend? Do you recommend therapy for everyone when they are feeling down, or the things that have happened in their life?
Well, yeah, if they can't get past it and it's a persistent, plaguing emotional issue, and they just can't move past it and they're stuck there, then yeah, absolutely. Therapy is a great tool to help you get through those things so you can deal with it. I was not dealing with my emotions. I kept pushing them away, and that's one of the reasons I was leaving my body. I would get all these symptoms. I just did not want to acknowledge the loss. It was too painful. And when I was writing my book, it was kind of intellectual instead of emotional. And my wife said to me at one point, if it's too difficult, don't do this. She said, because if I don't get it, your readers aren't going to get it. It's not worth putting yourself through this for the end product, which is not going to be a great work of art. So I said, no, I have to do it. When I start something, I have to finish it. And I went back and I dug in, and I let my emotions flow through it, and I realized, what had been missing, because the chapters then had powerful imagery and they had emotions that were running through it. In answer to your question about should everybody have therapy, I think if they feel that they really need it, and if they're just continuing with the same negative behaviors, or they feel themselves spiraling out of control, then yeah, absolutely. It's an invaluable healing tool.
Now, tell us about your book, Baderfield. What made you sit down and say, besides just feeling I have to get it out, where did you start in the book, and how did you tell your story?
Well, Baderfield was a little airport outside of Atlantic City where general aviation could fly in and out of. And my father was a pilot as well as being an art dealer, and I was flying with him from the time I was 6 years old. That happened to be the last place I saw him before he went on an overseas trip and died overseas. So I wanted to write this book as homage to my dad, who was my hero. He was literally everything to me, and my kids who weren't born yet would never know the greatness of this being, this superhuman being, unless I conveyed that through my words and emotions. So I started to write this book, and I titled it Baderfield because that was the last place I saw him. I don't know if I would call it that today. We eventually put a subtitle on it because I realized unless you were from this Philadelphia area, Atlantic City, you would not have a clue as to what Baderfield was. It was an airport, it's a ball field, a stadium, and it has to have been all those things at different times. So we subtitled it How My Family Survived Suicide, because it's really the story of how we were an all-American, idyllic family, and then we were blindsided by this horrible tragedy, and how we all managed to somehow claw our way back to life, which was a real struggle. And suicide is something you don't get over. You only learn to live with it as best you can, because you just do. It becomes part of you, and you can't run from it. I tried for years. Every time there was the anniversary of my brother's death or his birthday or something, I just kind of tried to ignore it as if it weren't there, and I got slammed. So, the emotional body really runs the physical body. And, I felt it important to write this book, and it took me decades because it was painful, and I had to go back and really relive it in order to do it justice. So it became a real powerful non-fiction family saga. It almost reads like fiction, but it's not. It's harsh reality. And at the same time, it's a very inspiring story. It's not just about death and tragedy. It's about how you succumb and overcome and move on from those things, and how you survive it.
Now, what were some of the things? What were some of the things that your family, or yourself, had to deal with? What did you find that you guys had to go through emotionally, or what kept coming up after the suicide as suicide survivors?
The first thing you go through is the pain, the agony, the disbelief. It's unreal, and it just doesn't sink in. I mean, it's just your world stops and everybody else is moving on, and it's powerfully disabling. And then there are, of course, feelings of guilt. You know, I should have seen something. And truly, I think that's what killed my father 8 years later. I think he just felt that he should have seen something, you know, as any parent would think. It's too much of a burden. And even though they got professional help, it was probably still eating them up. You then feel like you're in the public limelight. I know when I went back to school a couple of weeks later, I could hear the whispers in the hallway and I could see them. And whether or not they were imagined or they were real to me. It's kind of like, that's the kid whose brother killed himself. You know, and that's...
Right, because you were still in high school.
Stigma. Yeah, I was a senior in high school.
Right, yeah.
The stigma that goes with it. Because it was such an act of disgrace, you know, at that time.
Right.
That's funny. That's interesting that you mentioned that, because my senior year in high school, this was like going from first period to homeroom, and there was a kid that actually brought his father's 38 to school with him, and basically took his own life in between classes in the classroom.
Oh God.
Yeah, and I mean it was crazy that day. I mean, you know, obviously. I mean, now I didn't know him at all, but he was 15. He was a sophomore.
Wow.
And I'm like, okay, a 15-year-old kid just decided to take his own life. And like I said, I don't know him. I was a senior, so I didn't know him. Now, his sister was like on our dance team and marching band, stuff like that, but I really didn't know her that well either, but I just could not even begin to fathom what could possibly be going through her and her family's mind when your brother, at the same school you're going to, takes his own life in class. I mean, this was like nothing at the home or like in a park somewhere. This was like in the middle of school.
Wow.
So, and that has really stuck with me for years. I just didn't know. I mean, how does someone deal with that? Even if whether you know them or not. I mean, it's still the fact that it happened. You know, how do you deal with that?
It's a shock. It's devastating, and it's something that maybe will never really sink in. You know, it's something you live through, and it's like being in the armed services and overseas or something, and you see one of your buddies get killed, and it's just like it just, you know, it's a horror.
Right.
And you can't even imagine what would possess a kid to do that, unless again he was suffering from depression, unless he was taunted and bullied, and you know, that's another thing that kids today have to go through, and it's 24/7. You know, it doesn't stop with all the digital media. Kids are cruel, you know, and I think if they really knew what they were doing,
they can be cruel. I mean, honestly and truly, they can definitely be cruel. And this was an age before. This was before computers, before the internet. This was 1987. Wow. So I mean, no telling what could have been going on. And you know, I don't know what was going on with his home life. Like I said, I didn't know the kid. I know his sister, and again, I didn't know her that well to like see anything that could remotely say, okay, something's wrong with the home. You know, but it was just so bizarre and so crazy that I mean, they shut down the school the rest of the day, and there was just no way that anybody could concentrate or focus. You know, I mean, come on, you can't. I'm not ready for an exam now. I mean, this kid, you know, just took his own life. How am I supposed to concentrate on PE for that matter?
Oh, you can't. You can't. It just shreds your insides. I mean, you can't even, you can't do anything after something like that.
Well, just yesterday, I was reading about a kid, I think, I want to say it was in Arizona, I may be wrong, but he was a track star, I believe, and he was extremely, well, I guess popular and everything, and he came to school, and he was a senior, and he came to school, and he killed himself in the hallway. You know, and what he did, he tweeted to all of his, you know, I guess, people on on Twitter. He tweeted to them that there's about to be a suicide in the school, and
Oh, God.
and then he did it, and then he shot himself. And of course, people were in class, and then they came out, and they saw it. But the kids were like, "Oh, we got this tweet, that this was about to happen at the school," and he of course named the school and everything. And again, you don't know why. If you don't know what's going on in a person's head, I mean, there are warning signs, that they say that you can look for in people. Things such as quickly, if someone even says, I want to kill myself. I mean, a lot of times when someone says that, it is something that is overlooked, or they think, oh, don't say that. Oh, hey, look, you just, no, people just kind of shift over it. Now,
yeah, you're right.
Now I'm a social worker by trade, so anytime we encounter, if anyone says, I want to kill myself, for whatever reason, we have to take it extremely seriously. We can't overlook it, and we have to go into what's going on with them. And because it is a very clear warning sign, it's one of those things that is like a help, is a cry for help. And there are so many little cries for help that people do when they are depressed or when they are thinking about it. Because when they're thinking about it, it's similar to just, grief itself. As you know, grief causes a lot of different types of behaviors that are very similar to how the spiral downward of suicide. You become angry. You do have. You start blaming, God or whatever. You have, of course, depression is one of them, and and then isolation can be another part, and that's another thing that people do. They tend to isolate themselves, so you don't see them. You haven't seen them, and once they decide that this is what they're going to do, usually we use a term in hospice called rallying, where a person starts feeling better when they get really close to the end of life, medically, and they're dying. They may have like a day or maybe even a week before they actually die that they feel better. Their body starts feeling better, and they may get up, and they kind of rally, and then they die. So it's the same thing with suicide. They may actually start feeling better or looking, you don't know, you don't see the signs sometimes because, they must be doing better now. But it's because now their worries are gone. They've made a decision, and so they feel good about it. They know they don't have to worry about these things anymore. So, Carl, I know you were only 16, but as you grew up and everything, was there something that you look back on, or maybe your family looked back on, to say, I knew something was going on with him. I should have seen this because I remember when he did this. Did you have those kinds of conversations?
No, I kind of wish we had, because then we would have put our finger on it and paid attention to it. But there really were no signs whatsoever. I know his unit was about to go off to Vietnam, and everybody was watching the horrors of the war, with kids coming back in body bags and limbless, and and if that freaked him out, who knows? Could have been something else. Who knows? I mean, kids today, they break up with their boyfriend or their girlfriend, and they decide to take their life and kill themselves. And you just don't know. And I always tell people that the subtle signs that you look for, and you're right, if someone says they're going to kill themselves, take it seriously, because the worst you can do is humiliate or embarrass them, but you might just save their life. And I've always told people, if you see somebody giving away their prized possessions and seeming to drop out of society and not really have the interest in anything that they were strong participants in before, and they just kind of become reclusive and literally dropping out, you need to pay attention to that and call somebody, if it's a family member of theirs, or even the police or 911 or a hospital, somebody. As I said, the worst you can do is embarrass them, but you might save their life. And we saw nothing. We had no signs. There was no note. We're still left with a question mark all those years later, and people talk about closure. Well, guess what? There isn't any closure. For an event like that,
Yeah.
you learn to live with it, and that's it. And it literally becomes a battle scar. And whenever you hear about someone else taking their life, or whenever I do one of these interviews, and I've done hundreds of them, it all comes back to the forefront. It's 1965 again. It's October, and it's tough, But I feel like armed with this experience that I've had, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book, if I don't do something good with it, and I always use the phrase, I'm paying it forward by reaching out to maybe I'll save one person's life.
Right.
Maybe I'll save a lot of people's lives. I may never know. And maybe I'll help somebody who's been through it to help them cope, because we do survive, but it takes a hell of a lot of help, and encouragement and friendship and support. This is an act that's too big to confront by yourself.
I, for one, would love to read this book because, and at the risk of being transparent here, there was a point in my life where I had thought about it. And this was like late in my 20s, or like mid 20s. And it was a rough period, and I just didn't. I just gotten out of the Army, and I didn't know what was at stake here. I didn't know what I was going to do, and it was all coming to a head. And I had just seen a year prior my friends die. So it was tough. And I didn't know what to do. I couldn't bring them back. I'd seen them, weeks before they died, and it was just one of those things. It's like, okay, how do I cope with this? I drank heavily. I was self-destructive. It was crazy. At work I was fine. Probably because I had other things to think about at the time at work. But when I got home, I was by myself. Before I got married, before I had my kids, I was like, dude, why am I even here? And it was crazy. And I literally, because of the fact that I did not have anything to do it with, is probably the reason why I'm here.
Thank God. Yeah.
So, and I thank God every day that I never went through it, because I thought about, some of the, stupid things, like, well, if I fake my own death, will people miss me? Stuff like that, and the truth of the matter is, yes, people will, because, even as screwed up as I was, there's still people that genuinely loved me and cared for me. So, it was one of those things where it's like, all right, what do I got to do to snap out of this? So, and I started, I just wrote stuff down, just kind of get my thoughts out. It wasn't like I was going on public speaking tours or anything like that, but I would just kind of write stuff down and get out of my head and stop internalizing, which I think was the cause.
Yeah.
So, now it's better, but like I still, to this day, if I hear anybody saying that, I'm like, dude, wait a second. I'm immediately like trying to find out what's going on, because you just can't, that's not something you can overlook at all.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. All right, Carl, we have a caller on the line, and Q is calling in from Jackson, Mississippi. Hello, Q. Do you have a question for Carl David?
Hey, how's it going, everyone? Not so much a question. I don't know if I have a question by the time I'm finished. I just wanted to chime in as far as an experience that I had when I was mid-20s. There was a high school friend of mine who, one of those guys that always tried to fit in high school, and no one ever let him like in their clique, but we let him hang with us because, he was a cool guy. He tried too hard, but he went off to college, a small college in Missouri, and he went from being a tuba player in the high school band to being a starting safety on their football team at the college. And he just became like this really, he just became this jock, he was just the big man on campus. He had a 4.0 GPA. He was always smart, and he had his life together. However, he had a really bad breakup with this lady that he was dating. And so he came home. He was going into his senior year. This is a guy that planned on going to med school and everything. Going into his senior year, I was driving home one day, and I hadn't seen him for about probably 3 years. And I passed him on a road not too far from my house. And he drove by, and I was like, oh, man, that's Deuce, And I thought about turning around and going to to see him because I hadn't talked to him in so long. But I was like, you know what? I'll catch him sometime later because we used to frequent some of the same places. 2 days later, he killed himself.
Oh my
And
God.
over the breakup. And I felt horrible because I kept thinking to myself, had I turned around and stopped him that day, would I have seen something? Would he have confided in me? Would he have gotten it out of his system? I mean, and for a while, I kind of blamed myself, you know. And I didn't go to the funeral, which I regret that now, but I didn't go to the funeral because I felt like I could have done something, even though he may not have said anything. I may not have gotten anything out of, because I didn't know, of course. I wouldn't know what questions to ask or anything. But so I guess this is going to kind of turn into a question. In a situation where, and I must say I'm fine now, but I mean, this is a long time ago. But in a situation like that where you have people who may have been nearby a day or so before things happen, how do they cope? I mean, because it's easy to say, oh, I saw the signs, and didn't recognize them. But how do you cope and not feel guilt when you know you were that close to maybe making a difference?
Well, I don't think you can really blame yourself. I understand why you did, but you'd have no way in the world of knowing that he was going to do that. And maybe even if you had stopped to talk to him and he might have still had this burden inside him that was chewing at him. I mean, I understand how you feel and that you felt kind of responsible and maybe guilty, but I don't think you really need to own that. I think you need, well, obviously you have, but I think you need to let that go. And that said, I probably would have felt exactly the same way. Like, God, if I had stopped for a minute and talked to him, maybe he'd still be here. But, that's the X factor. You just don't know. You don't know. It's a tough call.
Yeah, it
probably
was
think
sad.
You didn't see him a couple days later, and so who knew?
Yeah, and I mean that's another thing. I mean, people should not take for granted. I mean, if you feel like you should do something, then do it. Don't wait and say, oh, I'll catch this person next week. And I mean, there might be a next week for you or the other person. So
Right.
I mean, definitely don't take things for granted. But now that I'm an adult and I've learned a lot more about suicide because I've been kind of getting in tune with mental health awareness. And this is Mental Health Awareness Month. And so I've been to a couple of seminars, and a young lady named Randy J. Flynn in Memphis who puts on seminars once a month. And I've learned a lot, and I know now the signs that I saw in people back in the day of depression. Now, thankfully they didn't kill themselves, but I think back on it, there are a lot of things that you see in people when you are aware of what to look for. I think a lot of people take a lot of that seriously.
Yep, I agree with you. I think so. Now, if you were encountering someone of that desolate state, or you think so, I mean, now you'll be prepared, and you'll be able to reach out. You'll know what to be looking for, and I think that's great.
All right. Well, Carl, can you tell us about what you do with suicide prevention? How can a person get involved, or what are some of the things that you do to help those who are either survivors of suicide or maybe even could possibly be thinking of it?
I think that the issue of awareness is probably key to saving lives, which is one of the reasons I do all these radio interviews. I've done radio, television, and journal interviews at every turn since the end of '08 when the book came out, and I'm still doing them. And at one point I said, this is eating me up. I can't do this anymore. So I stopped, but then I started again because it takes an emotional toll. But I feel like it's something everybody's got to get involved with. I mean, every time I see there's a movement for a suicide prevention thing, I'll jump in. And I've offered to give my books away just so that someone might read it and pass it on to somebody else who might be in an edge of desperation state. And then maybe it'll help somebody by realizing, people don't see when they're in that edge of final desperation that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And you don't die alone. You take your family with you, and you take your friends with you.
Oh,
and
right.
It's not a selfish act. It's a desperate act. But it does take a lot of people with you, and I think if people were aware enough and realized that they might have a second thought and choose to live instead of die, I was doing the It's Your Call show with Lynn Doyle, which is a cable show on Comcast years ago, I think in 2011. And there were two of us on there as suicide survivors. I was there, and there was a woman whose husband killed himself in front of their kids. And it was just like unbelievable. And there were two psychologists there, and one of them worked with an organization called Contact, and said, if you can talk to somebody for 10 minutes, just let them talk to you, you might change their mind. It's that 10-minute window that's so critical. So, I always tell people, reach out, talk to people. If you hear somebody talking about it and how horrible they feel and their life isn't worth living and whatever, step in and say something to them. You can't hurt them by doing that. You can only help them. And I've been using my book, and I've been a suicide prevention advocate ever since, and giving talks and reaching out to people. And it's funny because I've reached out to some major suicide organizations and have not gotten any response. When I offered to lend a hand, to help, put me on your board, do something with me, use my book, contact me, use me as a reference, an example. And most times I get nothing back. It's really bizarre.
Well, I know the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, they have local chapters. Do you ever contact them? I know they have Out of Darkness walks that they do now.
Right.
Yeah. And
right. I have gotten involved with the Out of Darkness walk. I've also gotten involved politically. The Pennsylvania legislature was trying to introduce a bill to raise awareness through education and make it a mandatory program for suicide prevention, which I thought was great, and it passed the House in Pennsylvania, which is where we live. And I was so excited to be part of that because it's the right step. Education is critical, and raising an awareness is critical.
Okay, and here's another question in the chat room. What is your opinion on murder, suicide, and school shootings? And can you look at those in the same way as a normal suicide, quote unquote, normal?
I don't think so. I think you're dealing with a disturbed personality. People talk about gun control and there's gun-free zones, and I think gun-free zones are targets. I think guns in the wrong hands obviously are deadly, but they also save more lives than they take. But you don't hear about that with the media. That kind of act where someone goes and shoots up these kids in the school and then takes their own life is just it's evil. It's demonic. I mean, it's not your typical suicide. That is just a slaughter, and that person's obviously not in the right mind. But if they had the benefit of mental health care prior with a diagnosis and continued care and restraint, those things might not happen.
Yeah, and that's another thing. Was not just depression itself. There are mental illnesses that people look at that you need to, when you're a child or your mate or whatever, your friends, if they're acting erratically or they're manic, meaning they're really, really happy or they're really, really sad, and it kind of comes and goes in these waves, and there's nothing wrong with saying to someone, let's go to a group together. Let's go somewhere together. Maybe they'll go with you somewhere, instead of feeling like, okay, well, you're just sending me off somewhere. And people do think of sometimes the act of getting help as if they are weak, and that I don't need anybody to talk to, or I don't need this, or sometimes we want our friends and family to be that source or only source of support. And there is something to be said for someone who is clinically trained to help you, because this is such a busy society, and people, they are so busy with their life, their kids or their job or whatever. It's hard sometimes to hear what other people have to say, and a lot of times we just want to be heard. We just want the person next to us to just listen to us, but a lot of times that doesn't happen. So with that, people get discouraged and they shut down. And there's nothing wrong with going and getting actual clinical help for whatever is ailing you. I mean, you may just need a couple of sessions, with a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a therapist, instead of thinking, okay, I'm going into a mental institution. People jump to that. And but sometimes even just going to a group where you can hear other people talk about what they're going through and say, you know what, yeah, I feel that way too, so I'm not crazy or I'm not alone. And that's one thing about suicide. You feel backed into a corner. You feel like you're trapped. You feel like no one understands, and you actually do feel sometimes that the people around you would be better off if you weren't there, or there is no reason for you to be there. So that's why you need, a group or something, or someone to say, you're not alone. It feels like you're by yourself, but you're not. There's so many people who feel exactly the way you do, and they've gotten through it. And, I think that that's the hardest thing to do, is to seek help.
I agree, and I think that that's key, the fact that they need to realize that they're not alone. They're not the only ones in the world with this situation, this problem, these feelings of inadequacy, or these feelings of desolation and failure and whatever. The whole world goes through that, at one time or another.
Right.
And if they could just reach out to somebody or know somebody was there for them. And, friends and family are fabulous, but it's sometimes just not enough. Sometimes you really need professional help to get out of that circle of desperation or fear or whatever you're feeling, that locus of the problem. And it sometimes really takes an external hand. And you're right, sometimes it just takes somebody to listen, so these people can vent and let these demons out, or let these things that are working on them so oppressively.
Yeah.
And then sometimes they say, you know what, I feel better. And that's that's the goal. That's what you want.
And a lot of times that's it. I just need to be heard. Now, Carl, have you ever seen the movie or the play called Night Mother?
No, I have not.
That was it's a movie. I think it came out in the 80s with Sissy Spacek and Anne Bancroft. It was actually a play, and they made it into a movie. The premise of this particular movie is Sissy Spacek is a woman who was living with her mother, who was Anne Bancroft, and she had decided she was going to commit suicide. So it was that last day of her preparation up to the end of the day when she actually commits suicide. And it's the conversation, it's more of a dialogue between the two, the mother and daughter, and Sissy Spacek, the character, was probably like around in her late 30s or 40s, probably 40s in that movie. But it is a good, I recommend that movie to anyone who is trying to understand suicide or thinking about it themselves. And the reason I say that is because it kind of walks you through the mindset of someone who is thinking about suicide. It's a very raw movie, but extremely good. I recommend it to see something like in a dramatic action, because it's hard to understand why someone would want to kill themselves. And even though her particular situation is just one kind of situation, but they bring up a lot of interesting issues. So it's a very good movie. I was just wondering if you had seen that.
No, I don't think I have, but I'll check it out.
Yeah, no, it's really, really good. All right, now where can we get your book, Bader Field, and where can people pick it up and contact you?
Very easy. The book is available in a myriad of places. If you do a search for Bader Field by Carl David or Bader Field, How My Family Survived Suicide, it'll come up probably in 1,000 different places. But easiest to find it is on Amazon or in the Apple iBook store or the Kindle or Kobo or Nook. It's in about 60 different digital markets worldwide. And it's an ebook as well as a regular book. So in softcover, I think it's about $16, and as an ebook, I think it's $7.99. It depends where you find it. but it's readily available. And my website is carledavid.com, CarleDavid.com, and the email is carledavid@gmail. So I'm available if anybody ever needs to talk or wants to talk or has any questions or needs some help. You've got a willing ear, and with no judgment. And that's the other thing. I think people, who are in that state of mind don't need to be judged. It's the worst thing you can do. That makes things worse, and they don't deserve to be judged. So the only other thing I want to say is that I'm working to get the book made mandatory reading in high schools all over the country, because I think it'll save a lot of lives. And the ultimate goal for me is a film, because I think today everybody lives in a very visual world, and not everybody reads. So I think that I've been told that as an updated version of Ordinary People, it would be an extraordinary film.
Oh, great film! Yes, great film. Okay, well, thank you so much, Carl, for coming on to the show. We really appreciate it. And
thank you very much.
Everyone, remember CarleDavid.com. And for those who are thinking of suicide or know someone who may be, make sure that you point them in a direction of the crisis hotline for suicide is 1-800-273-TALK or 1-800-273-8255. And it's, of course, a free call. So thank you, Carl, for coming on to the show.
My pleasure. Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Carl.
Pleasure. Thank you.
All right. We'll be right back, guys, with a little bit of